We are leaving our time now. We are leaving our time now. We are leaving our time now. And we've arrived in a time where there was a man whose wife had died, and a woman whose husband had died. And the man had a daughter and the woman had a daughter. And the two girls knew each other. They were friends. And one day they met up together and they went to the woman's house. And the woman took the man's daughter aside because she knew his wife had died. And when her own daughter wasn't listening, she said to the girl, "You know, I'd really like to marry your father. Would you tell him that, please? And if he says yes, I promise you, I will buy you full cream milk to wash your face in every day, which will make your complexion amazingly beautiful. And I'll give you red wine to drink every day to make your lips as red as ripe cherries. And my own daughter will only get water to wash with and to drink. That's how much I'd like to marry your father." So the girl went home and told her father what the woman had said. And he said, "Marry her? Oh, good grief, that's quite difficult. I mean, marriage is delightful, but it can be a real torment as well, you know." He couldn't make up his mind, and at last he had an idea. He got one of his old boots, which had a hole in the sole, and told his daughter to fill it with water and hang it up in the attic. And if the water was still in the boot the next day, he would marry the woman. So that's what the daughter did. And the next day, she noticed all the water was still there, because the water had made the leather swell up, and that way closed the hole in the sole of the shoe, so the water stayed in. She showed her father. He said, "Oh my, I shall have to marry her then." "You can't go back once you've made a vow." So he put on his best suit and went over to the widow's house. And after a short courtship, they were married. And on the first day of their marriage, the girls had also both moved in. The two girls got up, and the man's daughter found indeed a bowl of full cream milk to wash her face with, and a glass of red wine to drink. And the woman's daughter only had water. On the second morning, both girls only had water to drink and water for washing. And on the third morning, the man's daughter only had water, and the woman's daughter had milk to wash with and wine to drink. And so it was on every morning after that. The fact was, the woman was very resentful of her stepdaughter. She didn't like her. She resented the way she was much prettier than her own daughter. And she was also much more sweet-tempered. Her own daughter was kind of a bit grumpy and selfish. And no amount of full cream milk made her look any nicer. So this resentment grew as this arrangement of the four of them living together continued. And one winter's day, like it was really the depth of winter, the ground was frozen solid. The woman made a dress from some flimsy paper she had, and she called her stepdaughter over and said, "Look, put this paper dress on and then go into the woods and gather some wild strawberries for us to eat. That's what I want to eat. Nothing else will do." "But strawberries don't grow in the winter," the girl said. "The ground is covered in snow. It's freezing cold. The ground is as hard as steel. And why should I wear this dress made out of flimsy paper? I'm going to freeze. The wind will blow right through it, and the thorns on the bushes will tear it to pieces." Don't you argue with me, said the stepmother. Be on your way and don't come back until you've filled the basket with strawberries. And she gave the girl a piece of bread to take with her, which was so old it was harder than wood. Here's your food, she said. You'll have to make it last for the whole journey. We're not made of money, you know. And secretly she thought, if the cold doesn't kill her, the hunger probably will, and I'll never have to see her again. Good riddance. Well, the girl did as she was told. She put on this flimsy paper dress and went out with her basket. And of course, there was snow everywhere. Everything was covered in snow. Everything was white. There was no green to be seen. Nothing was flowering, let alone fruiting. And it was freezing. She didn't know where to go, so she just followed a random path and then found a path she hadn't been down before, and kind of in the hope it might turn up something, started to follow that. And after a little while, she came to a little house, a very small house, which was about as high as she was tall. And sitting on a bench just outside it, smoking pipes, were 3 little men, each about as tall as her lower leg. They came up to her knee. And when they saw her, they all got up and bowed to her. Very politely, she said, "Good morning." And the first little man said, "What a nice girl." And the second one said, "Very well mannered she is." And the third one said, "Ask her in, it's cold." "She's wearing paper," said the first. "Fashionable, I expect," said the second little man. "Chilly dough," said the third. So they went in, guided her inside, and they knocked out their pipes before opening the door. "Mustn't smoke near paper," said one. "Catch fire in a moment," said the second one. "Terribly dangerous," said the third. So they went in and they gave her a little chair to sit on, and the 3 of them shared a little bench next to the fire. And they made sure she sat very close to the fire so she would warm up, but not so close that her dress would burn. She felt quite hungry by now, so she took out her piece of very hard bread. "Do you mind if I eat my breakfast that I brought with me?" she said. "No, of course not," they said. "What is it?" "It's just a piece of bread." "Can we have a bit?" "Well, sure," she said. "It's very hard." She knocked it on the side of the table and it broke in 2 pieces. And she made sure she gave the biggest part to the 3 little men, who started happily gnawing on it. And then they asked her, "What are you doing here in the wild woods in the middle of winter?" "Well," she said, my stepmother sent me out to find strawberries, but I don't know where I can find strawberries in the middle of winter. And I'm not allowed to go back until I've filled my basket." The first little man whispered something to the second. And the second whispered something to the third. And then the third whispered to the first little man. And then they all looked at her. "Will you sweep the path for us?" they said. "There's a broom just over there in the corner. We just need the path next to the door clearing of snow so we won't fall over when we walk on it." "Sure," she said, "I'll be glad to." And she took the broom and went out. And as soon as she'd gone, they started chattering together. Said the first one, "We should give her something. She's such a nice girl, and she's in a bit of a difficult situation here, isn't she? She shared her bread with us, and that was all she had. She gave us the biggest bit as well. It's very kind, very polite, very unselfish. What could we give her?" And then the other one said, "I know. I'll give her a blessing which will make sure she'll grow more and more beautiful every single day of her life." "Great," said the other one. "I know. I will bless her in such a way that every time she speaks, a golden coin will fall out of her mouth. Great, said the last one. I have another blessing for her. I will make sure that she will soon meet a king who shall marry her. And gleefully, they rubbed their hands and waited for the girl to come back from clearing the snowy path. As she was outside clearing the snow, she found dozens and dozens of red and ripe strawberries hidden under the snow, as red and ripe as if it was summer. She looked back at the house and she saw the three little men looking out through the window, looking very happy. And they nodded at her, yes, they're for you, pick as many as you want. So she did. And she filled her basket and went back inside to thank the three little men. They all stood together again to bow, and they shook her hand. Each one said, goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. And then she went home and presented the full basket to her stepmother. Where did you get these? The woman snapped, unimpressed. I found a little house, she began to say, and golden coins started to fall out of her mouth as she spoke. And as she continued to tell the story of what had just happened, more and more gold pieces fell to the floor all around her until they were heaped around her feet. Her stepsister looked on jealously. Look at her showing off, she said. I could do that if I wanted. It's not that clever. The stepmother was very surprised and kind of wild with envy. As soon as the stepmother and the stepsister were alone, the daughter said to her mother, let me go to the woods. I want to pick strawberries. I want to find gold coins. I really want to. Come on, let me go. No, said the stepmother, no way. It's way too cold. You'll freeze to death. Oh, go on, please. I'll give you half the gold coins that fall out of my mouth. I promise. Go on. Finally, her mother gave in. She couldn't take the whinging and whining anymore. So she took off her own fur coat, which was very warm, wrapped it around the girl, and made her an amazing packed lunch. It was a chicken sandwich and a huge piece of chocolate cake. So she put that in a basket, and the stepsister went into the woods with that, and soon found the little house because her stepsister had described where it was. And right now, when she arrives, the three little men are inside, and she doesn't bother knocking or anything. She just barges in and sits down right next to the fire on the little chair. Three little men were sitting on their bench and kind of looked at her very surprised. The first one said, who's she? The second one said, she's not very well mannered. The third one said, she's a bit ugly too. She didn't look very pleased at this. She opened her basket and brought out her lunch. What are you eating? The little men said. It's my lunch, she said with her mouth full. Can we have some? Certainly not, she said. There's hardly enough for me. There's plenty, the three little men said. You've got a huge piece of cake and a sandwich. Go on, give us a bit of your chocolate cake. No way, she said. Get your own cake. They sat back down. Then they said, when you've finished eating, you could sweep our path. No way, she said. Who do you think I am, your servant? Sweep your own path. What a nerve you've got. They looked a little puzzled, stroked their beards, smoked their pipes, and looked at her. And since she was obviously not going to give them anything or do anything for them, and they were not going to give her anything, she decided to leave and look for strawberries. When she'd left, the first little man said, what a rude girl. The second little man said, very selfish too, very unkind. And the third little man said, nowhere near as nice as the first one. What shall we do with this one? Said the first little man. I will put a spell on her, which will make sure she will get uglier every single day of her life. The second little man, after a bit more beard stroking, said, I will make sure that every time she speaks, a toad will jump out of her mouth. And the third little man, who'd also had a bit of a strokey beard moment to think, said, I'll make sure she dies a very uncomfortable death. Meanwhile, the girl outside couldn't find any strawberries. She didn't look very hard. She went home quite soon to complain. But as soon as she got home and opened her mouth and said any words at all, a toad jumped out of her mouth. And soon the floor around her was covered in slimy, splashy, floppy things. And even her own mother was starting to find her quite revolting. After this episode, the stepmother became rather obsessed. It was as if she had some kind of brain worm in her head, turning the same thoughts over and over. The only thing she could think about was how to make her stepdaughter's life a misery and how to add to her torment as the girl was growing more and more beautiful every day. She could think of nothing else but how to get rid of her. Finally, she came up with what she thought was quite a good idea. She boiled a skein of yarn, called the girl over, and hung it over her shoulder. Here, she said, take the axe and go and chop a hole in the ice on the river. Rinse this yarn in the water and don't take all day about it. The stepmother was sure that the girl would fall into the icy water and drown. Again, the girl did as she was told. She took the axe and the yarn to the river, and she was just about to step on the ice to make a hole when a very beautiful passing carriage drew right up next to her. In the carriage, there was a majestic-looking man who was indeed the king. Stop, what are you doing? He called as he saw her about to step on the ice. That's not safe. I've got to make a hole in the water. My stepmother's told me to rinse this yarn, she said. The king by now had noticed how beautiful she was and opened the carriage door. I don't think it's a good idea, he said. Why don't you come with me instead? Oh, okay. Yes, she said, gladly, because she was happy to get away from the woman and her daughter. So she got in and the carriage drove away. The king started chatting with her, and after a while he said, you know, I'm actually looking for a wife. I've been advised that it's time I get married. Are you married by any chance? No, said the girl, and neatly dropped the gold coin that fell out of her mouth into her pocket. The king was fascinated. How did you do that? What a clever trick. Will you marry me? She agreed, and their wedding was a huge celebration with the most sumptuous banquet you can imagine, with the best wines that they could find, and the greatest musicians of all times came and played music and sang deep into the night. So everything that the little men had said they would give her had come to pass. About a year later, the young queen gave birth to a baby boy. The whole country rejoiced, celebrations everywhere, and of course it was reported in the newspapers. And it didn't take long for the stepmother to hear about it and figure out that it was her stepdaughter who was now the queen. She decided that she and her daughter should pay her a visit. So they went to the palace, and the king happened to be out. And when no one else was around either, they managed to sneak in. They snuck in, and they went into the queen's bedchamber where she was resting after giving birth. And they pushed her out of her bedroom window, which was quite high up, and she fell a long way and ended up in the deep moat around the palace, and she drowned. Her body sank into the depths and was hidden by the water weeds. Now, the woman said to her daughter, you lie down in her bed, cover your ugly face, and whatever you do, don't say a word. Why not? Said the girl. Toads, said the woman, picking up the one that had just jumped out of her daughter's mouth and threw it out of the window after the queen. Now, you just lie there and do as I say. She covered her ugly head, and quite apart from the toads, her face had been growing uglier and uglier by the day, so she was not a pretty sight. When the king came back, the stepmother was waiting outside the door, and she told him he had to leave his wife in peace to rest. She was a little feverish after the childbirth and needed quiet and needed to sleep. He took her word for it. He just whispered some gentle words of greeting through a gap in the door and then went back into his own quarters. The next morning, he came back to see her again. And before the woman could do anything about it, he said, hello, dear wife. And the daughter answered him when he spoke. And of course, immediately a toad jumped out of her mouth and from under the bed covers. Good Lord, said the king, what on earth is that? I can't help it, said the girl, as another toad jumped out and another. It's not my fault, and another jumped out and another. What on earth's going on here, said the king. Whatever's the matter? The stepmother was thinking on her feet, stroked her hairy chin and said, she's got toad fever. It's very infectious. It can happen after childbirth. It will soon be over. She just needs a bit more time alone with no disturbance. You better go and leave her to rest, Your Majesty. Well, the king was quite flabbergasted, but said he hoped she would feel better soon and took his leave. That night, when all the lights were off in the palace and almost everyone went to sleep, there was a kitchen boy who was still tidying up and cleaning the last of the pots and pans from that night's supper. When he saw a white duck swimming up the drain that led out of the scullery where he was washing up into the stream. And the duck actually spoke to him. It said to him, the king's asleep and I must weep. The kitchen boy didn't know what to say or do. So he just stood there. And then the duck spoke again and said, and what of my guests? They're taking their rest, said the kitchen boy. And what of my sweet little baby? He's sleeping too, said the kitchen boy, maybe. Then the duck shimmered and her form changed into that of the queen. It wasn't quite the queen. It was like the queen. And she went upstairs to the baby's cradle and took him out and nursed him and hugged him. And then she laid him down very tenderly and tucked him back in and kissed him again. And finally, she kind of floated back to the kitchen just above the ground and then changed back into the form of a duck and swam down the gutter back to the stream. and disappeared. The kitchen boy had followed her this whole time and he'd seen everything. He didn't know whether to tell anyone or not. He thought he'd just leave it. But then she came again the next night and the same thing happened. And she came again on the third night and the same thing happened. And this time, the ghost of the queen said to the boy, I want you to go and tell the king what you've seen. Tell him you've seen me, and tell him he must bring his sword and wait for me in the kitchen. And he must, when he sees me, pass his sword over my head 3 times, and then he must cut my head off. You got that? The kitchen boy said he did. He remembered everything, and he ran to the king and told him exactly what had happened and what she told him to say. The king was absolutely horrified. He thought he'd better check on the story, so he tiptoed into his wife's bedchamber and lifted the blankets from the woman who was in the bed, from her head, and gasped at the sight of the ugly face that was uncovered, lying there snoring, with several toads around her head on her pillow, keeping her company. Take me to the ghost, he said, strapping on his sword. So the kitchen boy took him to the kitchen where they waited. And once again, the duck swam up the gutter into the scully, changed form into the ghost of the queen, a kind of shimmering outline of the queen. And the king took a deep breath, got his sword, swung it over her head 3 times, and then cleanly cut her head off in one fell swoop. Right at that moment, the queen vanished, the duck had vanished, and in her place arrived the real queen, flesh and blood, fully alive again. The king and the queen hugged and kissed and greeted each other so joyfully. And then the king came up with a plan, because they had to do something about the stepmother and the stepdaughter. He told the queen of his plan, and she agreed. And she agreed to hide in a different room till the following Sunday, when the baby was due to be baptized. The king pretended he knew nothing of the deceit. And the next Sunday, the baptism was all organized and arranged, and the priest was there, and the false queen stood there, heavily veiled, still pretending to be the real queen, still not speaking because of the toads, with her mother by her side, both pretending she was too ill to speak. The king said, "What punishment should someone receive who drags an innocent victim out of bed and throws her into the river to drown?" The stepmother just piped up without thinking, "That's a dreadful crime. The murderer should be put into a barrel and rolled downhill into the water to be drowned themselves." "Then that is what we shall do," said the king. He ordered such a barrel made, and as soon as it was ready, the woman and the stepdaughter, the daughter, were put inside, and the top was nailed down with big fat nails. The barrel was rolled down the hill until it fell into the river, and that was the last that was ever seen of the stepmother and her daughter. And the king and the queen and their baby boy lived happily the rest of their lives together.